And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And it truly is connections that matter. And we're so grateful that you're able to connect with us today. My name is Giancarlo Brado. I'm based out of Toronto, Canada, and I'm the Global Education Advisor for Smart Technologies, also the co-founder of an organization called Catalyst. And I'm delighted to take you on a little journey for the next 90 minutes where we're going to hear from we're going to start off with Smart Technology, who's put this incredible experience together for us today with some opening remarks. And then we're going to get into our first panel, where we're going to look at one of the world's first studies on social emotional learning and the cities that participated. And you're going to get to see how much quality relationships truly matter. We're also going to have the privilege in our second panel to hear from educators, school system leaders, and engage in a discussion on how, despite the pandemic and these turbulent times, how schools across the globe have been able to create opportunities to enforce connections that truly matter. Now, before we get going with today, or the couple of housekeeping items, I want to let all of you know that if you do have questions during any of the panels or during any of the next 90 minutes, do put it into the chat. We have a team that's going to be looking through it, and we'll be sharing that with our moderators. As well, you will hear about links or resources. Take a look at the chat, as information related to how to access those will be directed for you there. And of course, many media are here present with us, both national, international, and local, and we'll be preparing a media kit for you at the conclusion of today's session. So we're super delighted that you're able to join us. And to start us off and to set the stage, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jeff Lowe. He's from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, Executive Vice President at Smart Technologies. And I have to say, he's been a driving force. He's been sending camera crews all across the globe over the last couple months, capturing some incredible stories of connections that matter, which are going to be shared. Some of you are going to be shared with you here today. So to start us off and to get us primed and thinking about today's topics, Jeff Lowe, I'm going to hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo, and welcome to everybody from wherever in the world you are joining us from today. Could not be more excited. The big day has finally arrived. This is something we've been working on for months, and a big build up to this Connections That Matter launch. This is a special day, and it's the start of a movement that's going to be happening across the world to share connections that matter amongst educators. So you're in for a treat today. There's an incredible group of panelists and experts and educators that are going to take you through the connections that matter to them. There's no shortage of events or articles you can read or sessions you can attend on what should happen or could happen in education and how challenging of a time it is right now in education. But maybe there's not enough sessions and time spent on all of the amazing things that are happening. Despite the challenges in education, there are amazing educators and amazing students and amazing policymakers doing incredible things all over the world. And that's what today is all about. These stories deserve to be shared, and that's what we call Connections That Matter. And that's what you're going to be hearing about today. As part of this, we're also going to be launching a resource hub. So during and after this call, and in the days and months and weeks ahead, you can go in and you can hear more about the stories. You can see the videos that we've shot. And then importantly, as educators around the world look at what's happening and look at these incredible connections that are being made, they can say, hey, I'd like to try that in my school or in my part of the world, and be able to download that and use those resources from our Lumio software that we're offering up for free. So that's something that we're incredibly excited about, the start of this movement. Now, you may be asking, well, what are these stories? What are the connections that matter? And I think they're going to be very widespread. It's whatever is in the eye of the beholder. The connections are various different parts of education. But certainly something that you can expect to hear about today is the prevalence of social and emotional learning and student well-being. That's definitely, of course, a key theme and a trend we've seen. You'll hear some results from some really key research studies. We are really thrilled and honored to have Andreas with us from OECD today. They've just published a very timely study on social and emotional learning. So we'll get into that in our first panel. We also just recently commissioned a study at SMART and talked to over 1,000 educators in K-12 in North America. And perhaps not surprisingly, but alarmingly, educators are most worried about their students' well-being at this time. And a couple of stats for you as a lead into this. 1/3 of the teachers said their students' mental health is their top concern, yet less than half of them believe their school have the resources to meet the social and emotional and well-being needs of their students. And furthermore, almost 3/4, so 74%, said it's harder to build connections with their students during these uncertain times. So that sentiment and those findings have really galvanized us at SMART to build this resource, to do sessions like these, to launch Connections That Matter. So again, you're in for a real treat today. Let me just close by saying two things. The first is I'd like to thank the SMART team and our SMART partners. There's many people on the call and some people who aren't on the call that have worked really diligently, traveled all over the world to capture these stories, to shoot the videos. You're going to see it's been a lot of work over the last few months, and I truly appreciate that for all the SMART team and our partners. And then last and most importantly, I'm really honored and grateful for all of the experts who are joining us today, the panel members, the speakers. Really appreciate you joining us and helping us in this really important launch. And so with that, I'll be back a little bit later with some other comments, but for now, I'll turn it back to Giancarlo.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And you know, it's such an important and timely time that we speak about this. But you know, these are conversations that have been had for many years. But it's time that the entire education ecosystem gets behind and does not just talk about it, but puts you know, the talk into practice. And super excited for our first panel. We're going to look at a global outlook on student well-being. And as Jeff mentioned, the OECD recently published a study on social emotional learning, the first study to provide international comparative data, and instrumental in setting up policy agendas, but also on making sure that we look at developing well-rounded and contributing citizens. Now, for something like this to have impact, it's super important, those of you that are here, that you help spread the word. And that's why this event is specifically for you that are in the media, local and national and international, because it's when we share the insight and the commentary that we're going to hear from OECD and from the participating cities and others, and as well as in the second panel, that it's bringing this to the ears and to the hearts of our parent community, of our external ecosystem, that makes sure that these ideas and these insight have impact within our communities. So super excited to introduce our first panel. We're going to have Sarah, and I'm very delighted that Sarah's able to join us. She's going to be moderating our first panel. She has an extensive career and wealth of experience as an education journalist. Currently, she's the lead content director at Learnit, which is a global organization that instigates dialogues that change the education landscape. So without further ado, Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our first panel and get us started in this very timely and important discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this discussion about the power of connection in supporting students' well-being and academic recovery in the wake of the pandemic's unprecedented disruption. We've got a fantastic panel for you today, and I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves, although indeed they need no introduction. Erin, would you be able to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Dr. Erin Baumgartner. I'm an associate director at the Houston Education Research Consortium at Bryce University. And we are in Houston, Texas, and supporting the OECD study from the Houston side.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And we also have Mervi. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sarah. And my name is Mervi Korhonen. I'm from Helsinki, Finland, and I'm working as head of unit. And today I will be discussing about the findings we got from this survey here in Helsinki.
Fantastic. And Tej?
There we go. Lovely to be with you all today. My name is Tej Samani. I'm based in the United Kingdom. I'm the founder of Performance Learning, and for the last 11 years, we've been deploying social, emotional, mental health assessments and curriculums across schools now around the world. So it's lovely to be with you all today, and I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Fantastic. And finally, over to Andreas to introduce himself.
Yes, I'm Andreas Schleicher. I'm Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, and we just conducted the first global assessment of social emotional skills.
And that leads us in very nicely, because the study is something that I think we'd like to have an introduction to. So Andreas, can you just take us through why this study is important and why you decided now was the time to conduct it?
Yeah, we know the importance of social emotional skills. In fact, our education systems know how to educate second-class robots, people who can just repeat what we told them. But in a time of artificial intelligence, where the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize, we need to ask ourselves what makes us human. And those social and emotional skills are really a key ingredient of being successful today at work and in life. We know that since quite some time, but it's just now that we are capable of measuring them in the same way as we can measure mathematics and science skills. So it's taken us a long time at the OECD to develop metrics for those social emotional skills, but that is now done, and we can compare systems. We can also look at some of the drivers. It's very interesting that we found, for example, the quality of student-teacher relationships was a very big predictor for social emotional skills, as was the learning environment, parental support. The most depressing results probably is that some social emotional skills like curiosity and creativity, students were doing worse at the age of 15 than they were doing at the age of 10. Our education systems seem to sometimes inhibit the development of social emotional skills rather than foster it. So I think some really interesting results.
And yeah, that sounds like some really interesting results. And just diving into what you were saying there about the disparity between age 10 and age 15, how much of that do you think is down to the sort of neurological changes that children are going through during that time, and how much do you think is down to schooling and the environment that they're living in?
That's a fair question. Certainly, as students become older, they often become more self-critical, they become more self-aware, and that may have an implication. But if that would be all of the story, we wouldn't see that same picture in the reports from parents or from teachers. And actually, we have those data, and we found that that decline was often also mirrored in perceptions of teachers and parents. So there is certainly, a psychological dimension to this, but there's also a real dimension to this. I mean, we are all born with an abundance of creativity and curiosity, and then in education we make people more compliant with certain ways of thinking and working, and take some of that creativity away. And I think that's really what we do see in those data. And I think that's it should make us think. If I would tell you we're doing worse in mathematics at age 15 than age 10, we would start to think, what we're doing wrong in schooling. And I think in the field of social emotional skills, that is, I think, a question we should ask ourselves: how we can, and even if it's psychological to the extent, we should still ask ourselves, how can we better accompany young adults as they grow into adulthood, as parents, as teachers, as school systems.
We've been talking broadly about students as a whole, but there were some interesting splits in the data. And in particular, I'd like to ask you about gender and how that plays into wellbeing, because there did seem to be quite a clear gender split in the data.
Yeah, first of all, the decline in social emotional skills is more pronounced for girls than it is for boys. So that's pretty obvious. But then you can also see that boys and girls excel on different dimensions. You had boys doing better on energy, on optimism, on self-regulation. You had girls doing better on tolerance, on openness, on empathy. And once again, we have done a lot in education to moderate gender differences on cognitive achievement, mathematics, reading, and science, and so on. But we have paid too little attention to quite important gender differences on those social emotional dimensions. Now, I think this is something, gender is one dimension. We see a similar picture on social background. It matters quite a bit. Students from privileged backgrounds just having a lot more resources in social emotional kind of dispositions than students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I do think it is important to put that on the radar screen of public policy in the same way as we do that with, mathematics and science.
And you mentioned sort of socioeconomic background, gender splits. One of the areas that the report didn't look into was the difference between people from different ethnic backgrounds. Was that a deliberate decision to exclude them from the overall study?
Well, it's just very hard to do in a comparative study. You know, those factors are often very specific by culture, by geography, by country. So we just didn't know how to deal with this in appropriate ways across systems. But I do think it's a very important, relevant question.
And throwing over to Erin, because I know that internally you've been doing some work around that. Could you talk a bit about your findings, what you found in terms of the disparity between different ethnic groups?
Sure. So in Houston, we work in close partnership with the Houston Independent School District, who's the main school district in our area who participated in this study, to understand what are the questions that they're trying to understand and answer. And so as sort of some supplemental work to the already great work that's been done by OECD, we have done some specific research in Houston looking at differences by race, by ethnicity, by linguistic status, because there's a great amount of variation in terms of what languages students speak here. And so really helping the district understand how variation across all these different areas works is really helping them better serve students. Because when we think about opportunities for students, particularly around resources that are provided to them academically and non-academically in schools, we're really focused on understanding equity. And so that's making sure students are getting what they need. So this is not about equality, making sure every student gets the exact same thing. There are some student populations that just by the historical nature of patterns and the way education has worked over time, there are some student populations that need more. And so doing the work in this way is letting the district understand how to outreach to specific populations and provide additional services.
And just to let the people watching know, there has been a link to the OECD report just popped in the chat if you want to have a read of it while you're watching this webinar. Also, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat there and we'll try to get to them if we can. So yeah, feel free, ask anything. Going back to the idea of this entire sort of session today, the connections that matter. How can connections between teachers and students, teachers and parents, how can that support well-being? If I throw over to you, Tej, first.
Sure. Great question, a very relevant question. So part of what we've been focusing on over the last decade is really breaking down this notion of resilience, mental toughness, well-being into sort of micro components, because I think often it's been treated, and I was nodding away in a frenzy as both my colleagues here, especially Andreas, your introduction around how it's so needed at the moment. Blunt answer to your question is we need to start looking at factors such as the students' relationship they have with themselves, the relationship they have with their subjects. I remember vividly a time in school where if you put an area of a trapezium in front of me, I'd have a mild breakdown. Whereas the Englishes and the histories and the slightly more creative subjects I tend to enjoy a lot more. So if we're going to put this on the global agenda and if we're going to create global change across curriculums around the world, we need to start to look at this in very small, granular processes. For example, the relationship, as I said, I have with my subjects, the relationship I have with myself, the amount of sleep I'm getting, the nutritional factors that are influencing my energy that I have throughout the day. The feedback cycle from teachers, how my teacher's communicating to me in a way that makes me feel empowered as opposed to me simply not getting it. So there are components there that now we can finally start to introduce in the assessment process, in the measurement process, to begin to get just baseline levels of understanding. Again, further echoing Andreas's comment earlier, the fact that if this study bluntly portrayed that math was on the decline globally, we'd all be up in arms. So I think there are two exercises here. One is very political for it to be on the agenda, that we must take this now not as just a nice to have, but more both as a way to survive and thrive, while these vital metrics, such as my perceptions towards my subjects, my perceptions towards my ability to learn, my readiness and my eagerness, approaching that I really don't like to use this word, but I'm going to use this. I can't think of one now. Approaching what was deemed to be quite holistic a decade ago in education as now being fundamental to the overall makeup of not only how our teachers are being taught, but also how that information is being received by the student. The way we sort of really summarize this over the last decade is, yes, what you learn is important, but how you go about learning that will create the sustainability and the transferability and the joy in the process of learning without teachers burning out, without students burning out.
I think there's some really interesting points that you picked up on there. And I think one was in terms of how do we empower teachers to feel able to deliver this sort of education? How are we developing teacher capacity, and how are we training teachers to teach social emotional skills in schools? Mervi, are you doing something over where you are?
Yes, when we got these results, we have been already doing a lot with our teachers, and we have in-service training program that we have materials for teachers how to deal social and emotional skills while they teaching math or mother tongue or arts. And in Finland and here in Helsinki, we combine these skills when we are teaching academic subjects at school.
And Andreas, how widespread is that across the OECD, the idea of social emotional skills being sort of built into teacher training?
Yeah, I think in many countries it's now part of the curriculum. I think that's really happened over the last few years already, that there is a recognition that we need to look at learning outcomes in a broader way, encompassing both the cognitive, the social and emotional dimensions. Teacher training too, but I do think the most significant element is not so much the training of teachers, but the work organization in schools. To what extent is it conducive to actually development of social emotional skills? I'll give you an example. When I look at teachers in the United States, they have quite a lot of teaching obligations, a lot more than in Finland, for example, and have smaller classes. So the trade-off has been, we want teachers to have smaller classes, and therefore they have less time to do other things in teaching. If I go to Japan or China or Finland, teachers would teach a lot fewer hours, but they would spend more time with the students outside the formal instructional settings. You have more time to engage with students. You stay with students for a longer time. You don't, rotate students every year, and so on. And that kind of, as a teacher, there's sort of three things. We know how important it is that you own your subject. You're really good at your subject. We know about pedagogy. You need to understand how different students learn that subject differently. But there is a third element, and that is you need to really know your students as individuals. Their dreams and passions. Who they are, who they want to become. And I think that part is often missing. And I think, do you have a work environment at schools that values that relational aspect? Now, learning is not a transactional business. It's always a social, a relational enterprise. And I think to what extent is that valued in a work organization in school? That for me is much more critical than just the formal training that teachers have. Now, do teachers see themselves as instructors, or do they see them also as coaches, as mentors, as facilitators, as social workers? I think that's really the key here.
And we've been talking about sort of teachers, but you said the sort of culture of the organization is key as well. And that sort of points towards sort of principals, school leaders. And Erin, I believe you've got some insights on that.
So one of the great benefits of the work that came out of this OECD study were conversations that our partners at the Houston School District are having with principals and school leaders across the school district, across the city. Because as Andreas mentioned, education works differently in a lot of different places. And in the US and in Houston in particular, there is a lot of autonomy that's happening on campuses. The principals and leaders are making a lot of decisions about how their campus is organized and how it's run. And so our partners at the district were able to take what we learned from the OECD study over the summer and do some professional development with principals for them to think about and reflect on what their campuses look like in terms of these social and emotional skills and how they want to provide opportunities for teachers and students throughout the upcoming school year, especially in light of COVID.
And another thing that I think Andreas was sort of starting to talk about, and also Tej, was around the idea of measurement. So you've been talking quite a lot about maths, and in terms of if we saw a problem in maths, we'd be worried. There's sort of a widely accepted idea of what maths is and how you measure maths, but how can we measure how students are feeling about themselves, and how can we measure how schools are prioritizing mental health services and well-being? So if I throw that either to Tej or Andreas. Yeah, Tej, off you go.
Sure. Okay, so it's something that it's pretty much been the last 10 years of what we've really tried to push through here in the UK. And mindful of the fact that I'll treat everyone in the room as friends over here and colleagues as part of the same vision, but we have a certain body over here called Ofsted. So coming back to just answering that question here in a moment, the whole notion from my colleagues in the room today is absolutely correct. Cultural change needs to happen, but ultimately, unless it happens, cultural change can't just happen in one school, because that school fundamentally is judged by their exam results and test scores. So if we're really going to do this, unless we change how we are judging success in school to be, it being intellectual performance or emotional performance, I think we're going to all still be caught up in the same rat race of what's more important, math results, or I'm more curious than I was, I'm more intrigued, more in love with my learning than I was 3-4 years ago. So to answer your question, the way I can speak from personal experience, the way we've had to introduce it is through the assessment in the early identification process, to start assessing these critical areas here in the UK in September, October at the start of the year, and run baseline assessments at 3 points in the academic year. But that data to be fed alongside their existing assessment data across core subjects, and that blend of having a metric to, in essence, benchmark social, emotional, mental health, perceptions, feelings, emotions towards learning, towards myself, towards my teachers, towards my parents, to form that holistic overview over me, treated as, if not more important, than the last set of math results I've got. We've, over the last 6 to 7 years, proven through various studies that we've conducted across multiple environments, multiple nationalities, and multiple languages, that by improving social, emotional, mental health, you can directly correlate that to improvements in cognitive performance and academic attainment. How we feel governs how we perform. We've known that for 1,000 years. To implement it system-wide and culturally, that's how we've managed to do it. 3 assessment points, 4 assessment points in the year, careful, subtle. I think Mervi's point earlier was absolutely spot on. And echoing Andreas's point of both implementing then co-curriculum based activities, which, yes, while you're learning your math and your algebra, address your relationship with that subject and whether or not it's causing you anxiety or causing you to feel inspired, has enabled us to definitely serve our schools, which, as if you're familiar with the UK, it's a melting pot of nationalities and socioeconomic diversity. But unless it's delivered through sort of, I call it global consensus in a school, head teachers, deputy principals bought into it as a way, and the only way we've been really able to do it, which I guess it's, while we are judged and judging students and success based on sort of your last set of exam results, it's a necessity. The only way we've been able to survive is if you do this, and if you measure this, and if you implement this, you will get better exam results and test scores. That was the first 6 to 7 years. Otherwise, we weren't even taken seriously. Now, and unfortunately, fortunately, however we want to look at it, the pandemic has all, I think for all of us, has enforced us to look more inwards and outwards, and no better place to do that in classrooms. So it is, speaking from experience, changing as being, well, in fact, let's measure this, let's implement this work, irrespective of whether or not it improves actual baseline results. So it's changing slowly, all too slowly.
Yeah, I very much agree with this. In fact, the survey actually shows that close interrelationship between cognitive, social, and emotional performance. And that's, I think, a good way of validating those results. And, I think it's true that we have started much later measuring social emotional outcomes than we measured, mathematics and science. Maybe we are at the measurement where we were 20 years or 30 years ago with mathematics. But I think we take too many things for granted when we look at math and science. How do we know actually that we really measure mathematical thinking skills when people solve, some algebra or geometry problems? We make those assumptions, and we make those assumptions because those scores predict something else. And I do think that's the same approach we can take to the measurement of social emotional skills. What we know is that they correlate very strongly to very important outcomes in life. And at the workplace, and to the extent that they are predictive of important outcomes, those metrics matter. I'm the first one to agree that we need to invest a lot more in the measurement here, but I do think that what we measure today is highly predictive of what is valued in our societies, and that's why I think this is a good start.
Completely, and just harnessing that. Sorry, Sarah, just quick point there from Andreas is it comes back to just going back to what is the fundamental purpose of school? Are we building to pass tests and exams in very one-dimensional based metrics and subjects, or are we actually trying to create the future of tomorrow, and how are we assessing, how are we judging them, and how are we building systems and tests in place for them to be able to sustain in what is now fundamentally the fastest, we're living in the fastest changing time ever in history as we get into the intelligent age. We've flown past the automation age. So I think what the report really has enabled, as with always with phenomenal reports of this nature, has enabled us all to do is stop, pause, and think to say, if we carry on the way we've been, what is the world going to be like in 20, 30 years from now?
And obviously the report was looking at sort of 10 and 15-year-olds, so children who had sort of done quite a lot of growing up already. But is there scope to test children at an earlier age? Erin, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the 10 and 15-year-olds are great snapshots for us to think about, but understanding students' social and emotional skills at a much earlier age is only going to help us figure out how to better support those students as they're moving through their educational careers, right? So, I mean, in a lot of places in the US, the beginning of formal schooling is around 5 or 6 years of age. That's 5 years before we're talking about, what we're reflecting on here in the OECD report. And so I think I'll encourage folks all over the place to think about how understanding students' skills, in a lot of ways, these social and emotional skills are the things we can measure around 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds that are much easier to measure than literacy and math skills at that age. And so let's think about how we can capture some information so we can provide the right kind of support to children based on their developmental age.
Actually, I should say we have done that. Actually, we have published our first study of 5-year-olds already a couple of years ago. And I should say it's actually easier to measure social emotional skills for 5-year-olds than it is for 10 and 15-year-olds, simply because 5-year-olds, you don't have to deal with things like, social desirability. 5-year-olds are quite honest in what they are going to tell you about themselves. And it's actually extremely interesting. And we also know from neuroscience that actually many of the social emotional skills are best developed in those early ages. When you think of empathy, it's a skill when you are 3. It's a personality trait when you're 25. And I think we need to better understand, when actually are we learning what kind of skills best. I would say, school was the education of the 20th century, cognitive skills that you need in the kind of industrial age. Early childhood education and care is the education of the 21st century, because that's where we develop those skills that matter most in the time in which we live, where, digitalization is taking over things, but we haven't yet grasped it. We have still, we treat it as a kind of institution of care. We worry about access. We are not yet looking at this in terms of how do we use that opportunity to develop social skills, emotional well-being, and so on. But the measurement part is actually a lot easier there. And we have very good data for the United States on that score, by the way.
And talking about measurement, so whatever you measure, whether it's, you know, end of schooling exam results, whether it's PISA or school league tables, there's always a sense that schools are looking for, sometimes, not always, but a quick fix and a way to sort of race up rankings. Is there a risk that if you start to measure how schools are building social and emotional skills, that you sort of bring this competitive edge in where people will be looking for sort of band-aids that they can slap on to rise up the rankings rather than a really, as Tej said, a holistic look at how they can integrate it into their school system?
Yeah, you know, I think there's always the risk, you know, where that measurement is becomes counterproductive when it becomes a narrow kind of high stakes kind of exercise. But I would also say the opposite. I think the fact that we have never looked at social emotional skills means that we have left it to individual teachers to sort out. In fact, one of the most intriguing findings from the survey is that you find very little between school variability and a huge amount of between teacher variability. Now, we have not built that intentionally into our education system. So leave it up, you know, some teachers doing an amazing job on this and some teachers care very little or do very little about it. And that is basically because we have not made that a deliberate part of our education system. You can never change what you cannot see. The question is, you know, how do we build meaningful metrics? And actually the measurement part is really interesting. You know, for mathematics, you can say the more you have, the better. It's very clear. It's a linear kind of outcomes. For social emotional skills, it's not so obvious. You know, you want people to have grit and to be persistent, but you don't want them to become stubborn. No? And you want creativity in some contexts. You don't want creativity in other contexts where actually your consistency is important. So I think the measurement aspect is becoming really intriguing. We need to look at the combination of those social emotional skills that matter in what context, and get, you know, through educators, get educators on board that this is about, you know, building strong relationships and lasting relationships rather than having quick fixes. You know, I think, but I do believe that the measurement part is really essential to give this the visibility it needs.
And one thing I'll echo. Oh,
no, go for it.
Is that I think it's important for us not to think about this as measurement as a form of assessment, because that's where we start butting into folks who are concerned about us over measuring, over analyzing, over assessing students. Really, we need to think about it as a way for us to benchmark and understand where students are so we can think about supports that can get provided to them, not as, to your point, Sarah, something that someone's going to get dinged for if they're not high enough, if a student's not high enough.
Yeah, and I guess how do we sort of communicate that to students as well? Because we know that students feel a lot of pressure over sort of high stakes exams. If it's not communicated to students that the measurement isn't necessarily a reflection of them, does it put higher pressure on them to enjoy learning, to feel happy, to feel resilient?
So it's interesting. That's something that we've found significantly, and this is where typically the context is absolutely critical. Are we, for the sake of the discussion today, are we measuring a 15-year-old who's got his end of year exams and quite frankly, this is a matter of survival for him to actually get into his next school? Are we measuring typically an elite performer who does very well but is panicking in the last sort of hurdle and is feeling anxious towards tests and exams? Or are we just trying to identify from a 5-6-year-old how they manage their time, how they diffuse stress and anxiety in the so with assessment, context is absolutely critical. Secondly, hearts and minds is fundamental to the deployment of this. We can't just simply deploy an assessment tool. We tried it for 3 years, no one completed it because it became well, I'm just going to fill in what someone wants me to hear. Yes, intelligent machines have evolved since then, intuitive assessments, but this is a collective approach between, and forgive me for the metaphor, the machine that delivers the survey, the assessment, the deliverer of that, but fundamentally the student buying into the notion that actually, if I look after myself and I look after the relationship I have with myself and my subjects, my performance will increase. Final quick point on this is there is such a thing, and forgive me, I'm biased, having competed as a professional tennis player for all my sins being in school. There is such a thing as healthy competition. I don't think we should shy away from that. I think a healthy amount of I want to do well, I want to feel like I want to do well. As Andreas hit at the head, we want confidence, but we don't want arrogance. So it's an intangible that we can, through data, make very tangible, and through context and through hearts and minds, actually deliver sustainability in the approach.
I think hearts and minds is that. Oh, sorry, go, Andreas.
Yeah, if I can just add one point to this, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we have made in education over the last centuries is the divorce of learning from assessment. We ask students to pile up years and years and years of knowledge, and then one day we ask them back and say, tell me everything you know, in a very constrained, contrived, and artificial setting, under a lot of pressure with, deciding on life and death. And I think that's where the problem really lies. And I don't think it's different from social emotional skills and math and science. I think what we need to do, and I think what the social emotional skills agenda lends itself to, is to reintegrate that learning and assessment, that actually students get that continual feedback, and through that relationships with their teachers, maybe also enabled by technology. I actually think technology will be a great enabler to better integrate the learning and the feedback and the appraisal and the assessment. I think, for me, that is a great opportunity to get away from that kind of very artificial, contrived way of assessing people.
Well, Andreas, your point resonates. You take a peak performing athlete, the notion of peak performance is falling in love with the feedback process. And I completely agree with you. I think that is something that has to be the next evolution, is helping both a teacher and a pupil. Because that's exactly what you said in the start of this conversation. If you can't measure it, you can't influence it. But how do you measure it if I don't like receiving the feedback, or I don't have a way to receive the feedback? So I think assessment's definitely the start point. Absolutely agree.
And when you were talking about hearts and minds, I'd be really interested to hear from you, Mervi, just how easy it was to capture hearts and minds when implementing this sort of system into schools. Was it something that you found people were very eager to jump on board with?
Well, some were, some weren't. And I think that's the situation in everything when we are trying to do some changes. I think when we have those teachers who are very engaged to develop new ways of teaching, and how engage pupils and students with developing new ways of learning, and when they share their new ideas and practices, we can have the best solution, and we can spread out those best practices. And one thing I was about to say earlier already, can I answer your question, Sarah, when you asked about how we can discuss these results with students. So we are at the moment discussing with student councils that we have this kind of social emotional survey results, and we want to know how pupils and students themselves like to discuss about them, and then we can make decisions together what kind of things we can do together that social emotional skills improve.
Brilliant. And I'm afraid we're reaching the end of our time, but I would like to give the last word to Andreas, just because there was a bit in your introduction to the OECD report that I'd really love you to talk about, because I was thinking about it from terms of introverts and extroverts and the way that each finds it easy to display confidence. So for example, sort of an introvert coming to this webinar, say, as a panelist might have found it a really big thing to do, whereas an extrovert would be like, yeah, put me on camera, brilliant. And Andreas, you spoke about it in a really interesting way in terms of an orchestra. And could you tell us a bit about that and how it sort of relates to social and emotional skills?
Yeah, I think we should look at them not, as things that we need to maximize on every individual score, but we should look at those social emotional skills as a kind of set that will be valuable in different configurations in different situations. And what we should do in education is equip young people with as wide as possible a range of those social emotional skills. And then, in some contexts, being an introvert will make you more successful. In some countries, this kind of extroversion will become a very important asset for you to be successful. And again, this is also, we should look at the learning environment. It's not about, teaching you now creativity in one context, but I think certain subjects, music is a great example. Teaches, if you play in an orchestra, I grew up in this way, you learn to listen to others. You learn to play a part in a bigger picture. You learn to see yourself in the light of what others are doing around you. And I think that's really, and that's what good education is about. It's not about just educating for very narrow outcomes, but it's about giving young people that self-awareness and that disposition to live with yourself, to live with other people, and to live with the planet.
Brilliant. I can't think of a more harmonious way to end the conversation. So I'll just end by thanking Erin, Mervi, Tej and Andreas for joining us today and giving some fantastic insights. And I'll hand back over to Giancarlo.
Well put, Sarah. If hopefully what you've taken away, what I have, is that this spirit with which we've had this conversation around measuring something like social emotional learning, very different when we talk about assessment of how our perceptions of assessment ring. I think we are on the right course. More importantly, what we should be taking away is that we're valuing this. Countries around the world are valuing it. We heard from Finland, we heard from the US, we heard from the UK. And as you mentioned, 9 other countries participated in this first study, and the second round has just started. And there's many countries that have already have this baked into their policy. But now we have to think about how it impacts the practice. And I think something that was mentioned in the early panel, the spirit with why we do this is about helping students and making sure we give them what we need. And we can't change what we cannot see. And so bringing a more wholesome view of how we can support our learners, the whole learner, I think is what I've taken away from it. And hopefully you've taken away from it as well. But we need to get it to the hearts and the minds of not just our educators and our leaders, but also our parents and the other communities to make sure that we're starting to create a shift on what school is doing for our learners to create these thriving and contributing citizens. Now, this is all made possible where we, transition the conversation into, well, what does this look like in our classrooms? And, we heard from Mervi talk about, teacher development and how important that is so that it translates into what happens on a day-to-day level in our classrooms and with our schools and our school communities. And so very appropriate that we transition to our next panel, which is giving a sense of what that actually looks like. And, I have Jeff back on here as well, because Jeff, I mentioned in earlier that SMART has been sending camera crews all around the world to capture these moments of these connections that truly matter. And you just got back last week and being able to visit some of these schools. So I'm curious if you want to share some of your experience of what you've seen last year's and a segue into our next panel, really. So Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, it's a great segue into the next panel of let's talk about what this looks like in some classrooms all over the world. And this is my absolute very favorite part of my job is I get the privilege of getting to spend some time with these amazing educators. So just last Monday, I was at Eaton School with Tara, who you're going to meet in a few minutes. And it's as Erin and Andreas were talking about well-being and social emotional skills at the primary age, at the 4, 5, 6 grade age. That's what I was witnessing, and just a brilliant job going from a full school assembly on the subject of student well-being to a full class instruction to a small group instruction, all engaged around the subject of what is my well-being as a primary child. So Tara, I hope I didn't steal her thunder there, but just an amazing an amazing organization. And the video is not quite ready to show you yet, but it'll be ready very soon. I've just captured some of it on my phone. And then another one of the panelists coming up, I won't go through all of them, but had the privilege of spending some time with a couple of years ago was the grand opening of NeoCity with Michael Meechin, who is one of the most innovative principals I've ever had the privilege of meeting. And the outlook that he takes to his students and how technology fits in, you're going to hear Michael talk about that, is truly exemplary. So can't wait to hear from Tara and Michael and the rest of the panel as we go and segue into the next segment here.
And this is so important that we start looking at, what does this look like? Because it's happening. And many educators and schools and hopefully the reporters that are here, we need to get these stories and we need to amplify them so that we make visible. Because a lot of teachers or parents or communities are already doing some of these, but how can we turn up the dial? How can we amplify it? And then map into the fact that we're going to prioritize and measure, and we're going to keep a pulse of it so we can support our learners, I think is the right recipe for us to really make a movement around emphasizing these connections that matter. Now, I actually want to show everybody, if we don't mind, if someone can share, I want to show you just where different countries around the world of where these stories have been captured so far. I also want to let you know that this is just the beginning. So far you see on the right, US, UK, Germany, these are sites that have already been visited. For those in the media, you'll get a media kit with some of these stories already for you to share nationally and also locally. But take a look at the future list of where SMART is headed next throughout Canada, more of US, Germany, Spain, South Africa, Nepal, Singapore, Australia, and there's many more to come. And the journey, for those of you that are watching this afterwards as well, we want you to be able to be part of this. We want to hear your stories as well, because we know they're happening in a variety of different ways. If you check my Twitter, I just posted one that happened locally in my community with a retired math teacher. Put the hashtag connections that matter, and you can be connected to all of these stories as we collectively as a global community start learning and sharing from each other how we can truly turn these insights into practice. So let's go right into it, because we have for you some incredible educators, leaders in education that are doing this, and we've been fortunate to capture their stories for you. And we are fortunate to have Greg Toppo with us, who's going to moderate this next panel. And for those who haven't met Greg Toppo, journalist for over 25 years, mostly covering education, 15 years, reported with USA Today, and recently a senior editor of Inside Higher Ed and president of the Educator Writers Association. I want to hand it over to you, Greg, as you have an incredible panel to take us on more of these stories of what's happening locally and as well globally. So Greg, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Giancarlo. Can y'all hear me? We're good? Well, listen, I'm going to jump right into it. We do have a really wonderful panel, and here they are populating the screen. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, we're all here. So I'm excited to hear from this panel. We're calling it Celebrating Connections That Matter in and Beyond the Classroom. Just before we begin, I wanted just a little bit of housekeeping. So we are going to do our best on this second panel, not just to tell stories, as Giancarlo was saying, but we're going to try to give you folks the chance to pose questions to the panelists directly. So, and the way we're going to do that is via the chat function. So the good news is that you don't have to wait till the second part of this panel or the end to pose a question. You can just pose it, as the conversation moves and something occurs to you or a question pops up in your mind, just put it in the chat. We have two very capable moderators who are going to sort of help us sift through the questions and pose them to the panelists. So you can start that as soon as you like, and we will get that done. And we'll devote a chunk of the very end of the panel just to questions. Unless nobody has questions, then we'll just keep telling our stories. Okay, so we're clear on that. So if you have questions, in the chat, all right? And just make sure you're sending it to everybody. So I'm gonna ask our panelists first things first to introduce themselves. And I will note that our first panel, like good educators, they modeled good behavior by making their introductions very short and very sweet. Really impressed. So I'm going to ask everybody to go around, and I'm just going to go by the sort of the order that I see folks. If that's okay with you, you may see a different order, but I'm going to start with Mike Nelson. Why don't you start first? Again, short and sweet. Just let us know who you are, where you're from, what you do.
Thanks, Greg. So Mike Nelson, Calgary Board of Education. I'm an education director here, responsible for a group of schools in the south of our city and teaching and learning with technology, and excited to be here.
Excellent, thank you. Great. Okay, Dr. West Jordan.
Hello, I'm Shervita West. I am the proud principal of Brandeis Elementary School in Jefferson County. We are the STEAM school located in Louisville, Kentucky.
Excellent, excellent. And remind people who may not know what STEAM stands for.
Science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics.
Great, you got the arts in there. Excellent.
Okay.
Okay, Michael, let's hear from you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Meechin. I'm the founding principal of NeoCity Academy, which is a public magnet program in Central Florida area. Excellent.
And I will note that as the gods would have it, we have a Mike and a Michael on our panel. If it's okay with you, Michael in Florida, I will refer to you forever more as Michael. Is that okay? Just so as not to confuse everybody. Okay, Ola, you're next.
So, good evening, everyone. Ola Brorson from Växjö, Sweden. I teach 6th through 9th grade English, and super excited to be part of this panel tonight and have a discussion with colleagues from around the world.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks so much. And last but not least, Tara.
Well, hi from the UK. It's evenings drawing in here. I'm both working with an edtech company, GLUU, but I'm also still in schools as an educator. So I suppose I'm a cog in between schools and industry, looking at solutions to help make teachers and children get a better deal.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so, you know, the first question I want to throw out, I'm just going to sort of throw out to anybody who wants to answer this. I actually had an opening question sort of all teed up to go, but then I heard that first panel and I totally changed my mind about what I want to talk about. So one of the things that Andreas Schleicher said, which I think, you know, he's always a fascinating guy. I always love hearing him speak. But he said a couple of things that really just stood out to me. He said, obviously, you know, we're seeing the need in this era to measure both cognitive and social emotional skills, which I think was, you know, something we were already thinking about. That enlightened systems, if I can call them that, really give teachers as much time as possible with their students, spending time with their students. And then the third thing he said was, and this is where I want to begin, his quote was, "Learning is not a transactional business. It is always a social enterprise." I'll read that again. Learning is not a transactional business. It is always a social enterprise. Feels to me like this, if you boil down everything we're learning post-COVID, it's this, that we have to treat school as a more social enterprise. And I guess my first question is just to sort of throw it to anybody who wants to start the conversation. Like, what are you seeing in your system, in your school, in your district, that is honoring that is making the place a more social enterprise? Who wants to start?
Well, I think anyone can start here. I'll just go off, but I think that's what this is all about: connections that matter. That's what it's all about. That students meet students from other parts of the world, that we are engaged as teachers in the classroom and not showing that we are superior, that we are here, we care for you, we want to create, you know, great relationships and prepare them for the future they're about to step into, and that we just don't talk about it, we show it by action. So I think that's a very important thing for us as teachers to think about.
I mean, do we need to be more explicit about it to our students to basically tell them, you know, this is something we're doing for you, or is it just, you know, or is it just something we can just show, as you say?
Greg, I can speak to that. So we need to be explicit about it. I don't think it's just with students, actually. I think we need to start with the adults in our buildings, and we need to explicitly tell them that there is less importance on the standardized assessments that we're giving and more importance on the relationships that we're building with our kids in our classrooms, in our schools. And if we don't explicitly have those conversations, because particularly in the States, you know, our educators are used to systems that have become very standardized. Andreas spoke to that in the first panel. And we really need to shift. NeoCity is a result of that. We have built a school, we're 4 years old, with the intent to completely redesign the high school experience, with SEL becoming something just ubiquitous that we do on this campus and everything. It's not something we just implement into our curriculum. It's not a program that we purchase. We hire really, really, really good people that care about kids, and they teach them content, and that I think is a winning formula, but we have to explicitly have that conversation.
I just want to jump in there. I think there's been significant learning through the pandemic, and in Western Canada, having to go to online learning, that what we've really seen as we've come and kind of returned and been able to stay face to face is the need for those connections, where we lost some of those connections as we've expanded online learning in certain places, about how we use devices or even connect students. Like I have in my portfolio online school, and they're creating online clubs so that students can connect. But I want to go back to what Michael said. It's also that collaborative connection of our teachers. So the sense of community within the school, but also that the school reaches outside the community, and how we connect with other resources and individuals to bring that learning, and so that it moves outside of the walls of the classroom, the school, and into the community and the larger world. And so I would kind of start there.
And when you say moves outside the walls, can you be more explicit? I mean, are we talking about, a place where you're sort of helping solve problems that are arising locally? Like what's the reaching look like?
Yeah, so I'll give you a concrete example in Calgary right now, that we're working on a project where our students have the opportunity to redesign a public space in Calgary. And so we're partnering with the city of Calgary. So, and this is a project ranging from grades 1 to 12. So it needs to be developmentally appropriate, but they're considering how they are citizens in the land that they live on, and how then they interact with experts that help do this work in our city. But they're bringing those various lenses. It could be science, it could be math, it could be art, but it's about how you connect and live in your city and also see your place in the world. And later on, I'll talk about another project that we're doing that will be part of Connecting That Matters. But that's just I guess a concrete example that how we partnership with our communities.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. West, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what's happening where you are in terms of the real life problems that you're asking students to confront.
I think it starts with our initial contact with students. Honestly, I think that many people think that we are sort of post-pandemic, and we're really still in this moment with our kids. They're learning to adjust to new normals. In my school district, we talk about what is our new normal, and how does that look in terms of priority for how we're interacting with our kids. One of the things that our superintendent has emphasized is relationships come first. We have to be able to balance what we do with academics, but really focus on the connections that we have with students. That's when they walk through the door, making sure that we're taking care of basic needs, because some of their basic needs are still not being met. And I think that as practitioners and educators, we just have to be aware, and we have to have critical conversations among ourselves about the priority of meeting needs, the social and emotional needs first, and then looking at the academic needs that kids have. When I talked to my fourth graders this morning, telling them I was going to do this panel, I asked them, what is the most important part of your day? They talked about their relationships with each other, having time to collaborate and work with each other, and the connections with their teachers, being able to have conversation and dialogue with their teachers. So not so much of solving the problems that they have, but being available to listen when they're ready to share their problems, or when they're trying to be supportive of classmates. And so I think we really have to lend an ear to listening to what our students need.
It's so interesting. You talk about relationships come first, and how I keep thinking about my teaching. When COVID hit, I was teaching journalism in the Middle East, in person. And then one day, all of a sudden, we went from being in nice, beautifully appointed classroom with, 20 students all around a big U-shaped table, to this, to 2x4 squares on a screen. And it made me really kind of just sort of look with horror on my own, I would call them almost like habits, my own like teaching habits. Like I really wasn't focused on my relationships with my students. It was all about the transaction. It was all about the skills. It was all about, what am I giving to you? What knowledge am I imparting on you? I mean, so I'd love to hear not only you, Dr. West, but everybody talk about sort of how, like when you say relationships come first now, like, okay, what does that mean? And I mean, you've kind of laid it out a little bit, but I want to hear other people talk a little bit more about that. But were the relationships not coming first before, or were they just sort of, were we sort of not
Greg,
noticed?
I think you
Yeah,
make a really interesting point, and I also noticed someone in the chat has just talked about this, that it's essential at school and it's post-pandemic. But actually, as educators in the room, it's absolutely not post-pandemic. It's always been there.
Yeah.
But just as Andreas has mentioned earlier, we've talked about this very rapid learning curve in education. There has now been a really rapid learning curve linked to well-being. And you shared that kind of quite shocking experience for you, 1 minute in a classroom and being reflective. And I'd love to share an anecdote of when we first in the UK, we started to hear some new language, and we've talked a lot about connections that matter, communication matters, and language is so key and so important, especially with young children. So the first time the pandemic hits in the UK, we have new vocabulary, isolation. Let's take that one word, isolation. So I was at the point deputy head teacher, and I heard some of my children, I overheard them. They had only ever come across the word isolation linked to the film Frozen. Kingdom of Isolation. And we saw this sister, well, she goes off, she's frozen, and actually the children had no concept. The register was being done, and we were talking about so-and-so is isolating their grandparents, links to, and so we had to start there. Okay, we've got some new vocabulary, children. Let's think what that looks like. What does isolation mean? That we need to unpick that. And it's something we're now starting to see, I believe, and it's positive with well-being and well-being in schools. It's a new skill set for teachers. We need to equip them with the language. As educators, we need to feel confident to have conversations with our children, and that will come from partnering with clinical experts. We've done that in our school setting through the company GLUU. We work with mental health experts to ensure that the language we use in the classroom linked to well-being is right. The language that we're using with children every day is important. Linked to well-being is incredibly important. If you're teaching math as a script, right? But do we have the same script for well-being when we're teaching it from age 5 through to 15 and beyond? And I think that's a connection that's going to be really vital moving forward, connecting well-being to the curriculum and helping educators with that script.
Excellent, excellent. Others want to chime in on the question I was asking?
I was going to say to Tara's, to her last statement, mental health and the importance of that. We forget that sometimes, or not forget, just acknowledging that, many of our kids who are returning back to school full time this year are, suffering from separation anxiety. They've been home with parents for many, many months, or isolated with their families. Some are learning to be readjusted to developing relationships, developing coping skills. And so our curriculum has moved away from a traditional teaching, just literacy and mathematics and all of those things, to really teaching those, in my school, we talk a lot about growth mindset. How do you persevere? How do you persevere through the things that you've been through? And how do you cope in a setting that is really new and unfamiliar to some students? And I think that that's an important part that has to become a part of our dialogue and language as educators now.
Yeah.
Just wanted to add, following that same theme. So I think one of the pieces, though, that you're sharing, Tara, is none of us on this panel are going to say that relationships haven't always been important, right? Fundamentally, we've all been teachers, and it's that connection that you make. And I mean, your best day at work is, you connected with your students, or that maybe that student that you hadn't really connected with, and they came back and asked you for help, right? But I think what we're kind of talking about, and what the report it speaks to, is about some aspects of common language. I can share with you, in our district for a long time, we've talked about relationships. For the last several years, we've had in our school development plans a well-being goal. But what I'm hearing about is, what is the consistency? So we have lots of schools that are working on resiliency or grit, mindfulness. It's all the right work, but how do we support educators about some of those aspects of common language? And that's something that we need to work on here. And so that is those connections. And I thought what Andreas said is, it can't just be, it's not about a narrow set of outcomes, right? Yeah. So, we have in Alberta, we have a provincial curriculum. It's a strong provincial curriculum, but well-being and wellness is embedded in that and has to be taken up, whether I'm learning physics 20 today, or I'm in a grade 1 generalist class. And I think the piece around that we sometimes come back to the pandemic is, as you said, Dr. West, some of our students have shown up, and we know there's also an equity difference, right? So when we talk about leadership standards, we quite often talk about contextual understanding, and that's for the teacher and administrators. And just really passionate about this work, and appreciate, Tara, how you're kind of honing in about that common language for all of us.
One of the things I worry about, I think it was Dr. West who said something about sort of going back to normal, or we're not in the post-pandemic period yet. I think that was how you said it. And, it made me think of an interview I had a couple of weeks ago with a mother in Oakland who basically said, the subject was the COVID pandemic. And she said, everybody wants to go back to normal. She says, I don't want to go back to normal. like normal is what got us here, where our kids can't read and do math. Like, I want something else. Like, normal is the problem. So, and I guess what I wonder, we're kind of getting close to the last part of this panel. I guess I wonder, looking ahead a little bit, maybe a year or two, when we are out of this crisis stage, when kids are back, almost entirely back in the buildings, when we don't have to think about, infection and isolation and masks and all this every day, I guess I wonder, what will here's a funny way to ask it, but like, what will we have stopped doing? Like, what are the to use my phrase, bad habits? What are the bad habits that we, with any luck, will have sort of dispensed with? Once this era is done. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think one thing we have to learn from this is everything that can be digitalized will be digitalized, right? And that's what we're talking about here. So we have to take the boring stuff away from the teacher, have the computer do that. And one of the things that I love about Connections That Matter, that I, as a teacher in Sweden, get to collaborate with the school in Miami, real time. I'm talking to their students. We're working in Lumio, asking questions, and it's like the world is out there. My smart board is my window to the world, and I feel those are the things that we need to not stop with it now. Not go back to normal, but take the good things out of it, take the good parts out of it. And for teachers, I always say a good teacher is a happy teacher, and I love being happy in the classroom, and I want to create that atmosphere in my classroom, and take out all the good stuff. You can get more people into the classroom. I don't have to fight there, because I can invite people to my classroom. The world is ready for this now. So I think that's what we need to learn from this.
So you're thinking, just to follow up, you're thinking sort of what's going to happen is we're going to sort of, if you will, streamline teachers' work in a way so that they are only doing the things that sort of just humans are good at. Is that,
yeah, I mean,
is that a way to think about it?
If we think about it historically, knowledge would be in school. People would come to school because that's where all the knowledge is. Why do you have to go to school now? Why can't you just sit at home and learn by yourself? I mean, that's the whole thing right now. You can learn everything on YouTube, right? So for the relationships, So I think that's where we as teachers have to understand that.
Excellent. There's actually a comment from James Brown, who wants us to know that comment from the mom in Oakland shows that there's always been a connection between SEL and academic performance, such that focusing on the former unquestionably uplifts the latter, whereas focusing predominantly on academics compromises well-being.
And Greg,
Tara,
it was just to add to that comment. We've been doing a really interesting study in the UK looking at a transition piece. So we have age about 10, 11 in the UK. You finish primary or elementary and move to secondary. And we've worked with a cluster of schools that when the children are starting at secondary, rather than having lots of different teachers in the individual subjects, they have an extended transition piece where they have more hours with one teacher, and the root of that is the SEL, it's the well-being, it's ensuring knowing and understanding the child, and that one teacher then is delivering the different subjects. I think if we can look down in education to early years and to primary and see what happens really well, and we can learn some really good stuff from the teachers of 4 and 5-year-olds. And you talked about context, Greg, and I know that other educators here will agree. In the early years, you find out what the children are interested in, and that leads their learning. So we're guided by what sparks their creativity, what they're interested in, how they want to learn. And then you start to build curriculum and structures around the interests. And I think I can see Michael nodding, so I'm guessing that's something that that's where you're going.
I wanted to just add on. We actually do something here at NeoCity Academy that are called deep dives. And I think that what Tara just spoke to, it needs to be a cultural part of our school culture. So one of the things during our deep dives, my entire staff teaches deep dives. So my head custodian, our secretarial staff, my school nurse, in addition to our teachers, and they're driven by student interest. So students are spending time, and I think Andreas spoke to this in the first panel, about us spending time with kids outside of the normal scheduled content time. And the interactions that we get to see, when kids are spending time, working on yoga with my school nurse, is just, those things are incredible. And like, I get to experience that. I get to work here, which I say is often, it's just incredible. Those are the things that we need to do more of. We have to find our purpose. Like, we have to find our why. And if we can't answer the question why we're doing the things that we're doing, which public education in the United States, we need to ask that question more often. We have to stop doing them. Like, let's focus our time and energy on the things that we've been talking about for the past hour and a half, and stop doing less of the things that we don't need to do.
But I guess I want to just make sure I understand your yoga example. For instance, yoga with the school nurse or whoever it was. I mean, is the thing that makes that important and special that the teacher herself was doing something she was interested in? Like,
Greg, it's the connection that our kids can make with adults, any adult on this campus. And it's knowing that, it's not just the teacher that they have in class, but it is literally an army of adults in this building that will stand behind you, that you can go to. Our kids are, post-pandemic, there are so many stressors, and SEL is going to continue. And even though we did it pre-pandemic, it's going to continue to become an issue. So for us as a school culture here at NeoCity, we have to show them that we have a team of people here that can provide them with an outlet whenever they need it. So it is putting them in those unique situations that are not done at most schools, and giving them multiple adults that are just outside the normal classroom teacher. And our teachers do a great job of it too, but it's them understanding that anybody on this campus they can build a relationship with, and will help them in any way that they can.
Yeah. Tara was talking about sort of like looking down at the earlier levels of kindergarten, to all the way, maybe even to kindergarten or primary school. There was a great book a couple of years ago by Mitch Resnick from MIT called Lifelong Kindergarten, which makes this point, which is that we should go visit some kindergartens, see how they interact with students, see the questions they ask, the attitudes that they have about learning, and think about how we can bring that to everybody. There's a question here from Kelsey Hansen who asks, and this is a really interesting way to kind of flip this. She says, I think Kelsey is a she, but I don't know. How do connections with parents change post-pandemic? Parents. Students used to spend much more time in their day with teachers rather than parents, and that has shifted. Interesting. Some parents, in some cases, begrudgingly became their kids' in-person teacher for a few weeks at a time. So that's the first question. Then also, how can communication shift with parents affect the SEL learning of students? So let's bring parents into this, which we haven't really done. Somebody want to tackle that?
I think when we see parents as co-collaborators and not just entities that we give information to, that we really bring them into the process of their children's learning, that it becomes a whole different dynamic for us as educators. I think one of the things that we learn through using technology, we didn't have to limit parent visits or conversations to them coming to the school. We could do that, and we could do that at moments that were convenient for the parents and not necessarily just for the educator. And so I think it became a more collaborative process, at least in our experience, where we were able to communicate and talk with many more parents than we were during prior to the pandemic happening. And so I really do think that that's important. We also have to remember that all parents don't start at the same level, that the same challenges sometimes that exist, communication issues for the student may be a factor for the parent. You know, we talk a lot about resources. When you ask the question, now that we're coming out of this time, and what would I want it to look like 5 years down the road? For us to be much more intentional about access for all of our students, for us to be much more intentional about equity and making sure that we're addressing the whole child's needs and not just the academic. So when we talk about social and emotional learning, also realizing that what happens outside of our buildings really do impact what we see coming into our building, and even what we see show up on screens when we were in virtual classrooms. And so I think Kelsey, a long way around answering your question, is really about collaboration and connecting with our families in a much more intentional and meaningful way moving forward.
You know, I mean, I don't want to be a jerk about this, but, you know, and a lot of the things we're seeing maybe in the news is not the best reflection of this. We're seeing things go in the other direction, aren't we, with parents? We're seeing angry parents, you know, screaming parents at school board meetings. Should we put that in a certain kind of context, Dr. West?
I think, you know, a lot of times, at least from our conversations as a school district and even as a school, parents are not upset or angry because we want to be more communicative about their kids' learning. I don't think that is the case. I think sometimes the channels that we have to make that happen, they don't feel like they're included in the process. They want to have voice in the process. And so I do think that that becomes a reflection of how we generate dialogue among our parent communities. When I feel connected to my child's learning, when I feel connected to my school, when I feel like I have voice and choice, I'm not really yelling and screaming about not being included in the process. I'm feeling like I really do have some decision-making ability in what's going on in my child's education.
I just wanted, Greg, so Dr. West, I think you summed that up really well. I think we also realize that our parents are the champions for their children. We want them to be champions for their children, and we want to work with them. I think, Greg, back to your point though, in my role, I have a basic responsibility for almost 13,000 students, and I go to schools every single day. And when it boils up, it comes my way. But I always have to remember, it is a fraction. Like we're talking 0.1, 0.2%. And sadly, it's the media then, of course, takes that story. But as Dr. West is saying, I think overarching, our teachers, our administrators are working to build those connections. And, here in Calgary, really what we're hearing is parents want to get back into their schools because they want to be part of the learning of their children. And I think that's what we're hearing, whether it's the social emotional piece, is we want to make those connections. And, Michael, it's that idea of let's use the wonder, right? Tara's talking about those early years. Let's use the wonder of our students. Our students have an understanding. They know about the environment. They know that we need to have clean drinking water. They know people don't have food. They want to solve those problems, and we developmentally appropriately propose those problems and work with them, whether that's in Div 1 or it's grade 12 students that are out accessing our own knowledge as teachers, right? That's the beauty of what we do each day.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I'm going to do a very, very quick lightning round. And when I say quick, I mean like one sentence, okay? So I'm going to go around the horn, and I'm going to ask you all to give me one reason why we should be optimistic. Who should I start with? I'm going to let somebody pick themselves. Who wants to start?
The one word is children, because we're working with children, and I think that throughout it all, and I just saw a huge smile straight away. That is our privilege in this profession, and if you work with children, you always have a reason to be optimistic.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Who wants to go next? Do I need to choose someone? Can I need to be a bad teacher and choose someone? Let's go with Mike.
I'll go ahead. Oh,
okay, Michael.
How about Mike? How about Michael? Yeah, all right. Yeah, no, I think that I think the work that our kids are doing on this campus and throughout Osceola County, and I know at many of the schools that panelists are representing here, the work that they're doing is incredible. There's a lot of hope, and we should be, we underestimate these kids sometimes, and they can do some incredible things. So,
excellent, thank you. Okay, good. Who's next?
They wanted to come back post-pandemic. The kids wanted to come back. They wanted to be with their teachers, and they have questions. It's what the first panel said before us. So let's harness that, and let's find the goodness in that, the goodness in humanity. That's why I visit schools every day.
Excellent.
And I think they're not forced to learn; they want to learn. I mean, that's the whole thing. Globally, we have to show examples of, have them meet each other and learn from each other. And it's not about me as a teacher, it's about them learning. I think that we need to focus on that.
Excellent. And Dr. West, you're going to get the last word.
I was going to say, to sum it up, I think Oleg said it best. It matters. What we do matter. It matters every single day. Our children's future is depending on the passion and energy that we bring to the job every day. And we have to show up for them because it matters.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. This is a big panel. Lots to say, lots of topics. Really pleased to chat with you today. Thank you so much for being part of this, and thank you for all your work. I'm going to kick back to Giancarlo and let him take it from here.
Oh, thank you so much, Greg. And I was looking at the chat there with Katie, so many reasons to be optimistic. And many of you have shared some incredible examples of that. And I think one thing that rings true is how we need to be intentional with how we build these connections. And it, to start off with, Greg mentioned that comment about learning is not a transactional process. It's a social process. And we heard from the panel today, it's not just within schools, and with different parts of the people within our schools, as Michael was mentioning in his school, but it's with the homes, as Dr. West was mentioning, the importance of connecting with home, but also the broader community, and Dr. Nelson with the initiative they're doing with their city. It's important that we look outside of our walls as well, and Ola with the international connections with students in other parts of the world, and with our early learners, never too young to engage them in this as well. And so it's been a pleasure to hear from this panel and the previous one as well. I'd love to bring Jeff back on to the stage, as I'd love to get any reactions from this panel, but also our previous panel as well. Jeff, what's going through your mind as you hear this global conversation around these connections that are truly making a difference?
I'm not sure where to start unpacking it all. Giancarlo, can I take another hour or so to do that? Probably not, right? There's so much there to talk about. I think, the really interesting thing just for me from the first panel, just one thing that really stood out is the measurement piece on SEL, and how do you measure it? And as Tej said, how do you do that and not make it like a machine? I think that's really key to try to crack that code. And then what really stuck out for me from the last panel was when some of the various panel members were asked words to the effect of what's the most important thing right now in education, the words that were played back, right? So Dr. West said relationships are just so critical. You know, Mike and Tara talked about communication and having a common language. Ola talked about happiness, right? A good teacher is a happy teacher. And what's fascinating about that is all of those things, and as going back to what the study shows, all of those things torque the academic side. So to me, those are just some of the insights I got back, but just amazing. Both panels I thought were fantastic. Just a couple final words from me, Giancarlo, if I could.
Absolutely.
All the 5 panelists who we just had on, all of their stories are detailed at the Resource Hub. So please, if you'd like to hear more about what they're doing, because you just got a very small glimpse of what they're up to, you can find this full story on the Resource Hub. And as I said before, this is not just a moment, this is a movement. So we've captured, as you saw on that map, over a dozen stories so far. We've got about 50 on the docket all over the world, and we'll continue to do this in the months and years ahead. And by the way, if anybody listening or watching in has a story to say, hey, I have an incredible story, an incredible connection that matters, please bring it forward to us, and we'll make sure we profile it, because that's our commitment as a company.
I love that. And you know, I think it's up to all of us, right, to share these stories of what's happening, what's working within our worlds, within our ecosystems. And actually, you know what? Why don't we pull up if someone in the back end can pull up that slide with the map, because I want to share actually. I want everybody to get a sense of some of these stories that we've heard today from some of the panelists. And let's just scroll through it, if you don't mind. Just go through and you can see some of these schools that have already been captured, and some of these connections, you know, connecting with other classrooms and cultures around the world, or connections between students and those with special needs, connecting with well-being. We heard that today, of course, curiosity with STEM learning. And let's keep scrolling through that, because I want everybody to see, you know, every school, and, you know, those of you that are listening to the recording even afterwards or live now, you are all part of one of these stories. And it doesn't matter who you are, right? Whether you're a parent, or you're an educator, or you're within the school system or a supporter of the school systems, you're all a contributor to creating these moments. And these are all moments that, as Jeff has mentioned, have been captured, that are shared. And a lot of these have lessons, and these educators have been very gracious of creating these lessons, and they'd be posted through Smart's free platform Lumio, where everybody can help create these experiences in their own classrooms and own communities, if this is something that interests them. So we want to make sure everybody has access to that. We'll send information following this webinar as well. But you can see so many incredible stories, so many more stories to come. And I should mention, today is actually the first of a kickoff of a 3-day event, because happening tomorrow, there's actually going to be an event that's going to take different schools from around the world, including some that joined us today, to share with each other some of these stories. And these are, it's called the Illuminate event, and it's going to happen on Smart's 360 platform. The invitation's extended to all of you here. So if you want to connect further with everybody that you heard here today on the panel, but also with other schools and other educators, we're going to share with you how you can do that. Now, if we can, if there's time permitting, we'd love to take a little tour of what this immersive platform looks like, because it's not so much about, of course, what you heard today, conversations, but it's really around making connections. And so you can see here, you're in this main, a foyer, but there's a research room, there's an exhibit hall where you can connect with different schools and resources. There's an education auditorium. So here you're seeing the exhibit hall. And you can go through and actually connect and have chats with folks from these different schools. So there's NeoCity Academy. And so you can see resources from the school and some of the stories that were captured. So we're super excited. This has all been put together, and all of you today have access to this over the next couple days as well. The recording of today will be made playable back through this immersive platform. And of course, we'll send everybody a link to do that. And of course, as was mentioned, take a look at the hashtag. Let's get involved. Let's share these stories of connections that matter. We look forward to bringing and sharing and interconnecting with all of you beyond today. Today is really just a kickoff of this. And to wrap off to wrap up this incredible conversation and connections that we've made with one another today, we're going to share with you a little glimpse of one of the stories that we've captured from NeoCity schools. And with that, it's been my pleasure to host you today. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank all of you that take the time to share your perspectives. I also want to thank our moderators, Sarah and Greg, for incredible instigation of dialogue and connecting and weaving the threads. And of course, none of this would be possible without some incredible partners from Whiteboard Advisors, from Holders Communication, Amanda, and of course, an orchestrator to conduct us all, Cheryl Fisher from SMART, and of course, big thank you to Smart Technologies, who's instigator of this and will continue to make sure that we put a highlight on these connections that matter. So with that, I'm Giancarlo. It's been a pleasure being your host today. I'd love to end with this little video to give you a taste of what we talked about, connections that matter.
Case studies are just case studies. I think that anytime that we can give students a curriculum that requires them to solve problems that are in their local community, I think that that's when they truly make a connection to it.
Real world, beyond school, not just here, beyond school. What do you got? What do you see? What are you working with? What do you have a passion about? What do you see out there that needs to be fixed? So by being able to design your own curriculum to involve what the students are going to see when they leave school, as opposed to a curriculum that's a canned curriculum that doesn't involve that, has made a great difference.
Real world problems. I feel like this very unit we're currently covering, bioinformatics used to identify pathogens and infectious agents. It's very real right now because of the times we're living in, middle of a pandemic. And so it lets the kids see what is currently happening in labs right now across the nation. Bioinformatics labs, epidemiologists, what are they doing? They're doing a little bit of epidemiology as well.
There's biology in those problems. There's mathematics in those problems. There are social sciences in those problems. There's no shortage of problems, unfortunately, you know? So it's really an unlimited source for us, right? Like we're educating kids to have skill sets that hopefully will be able to really think their way, you know, through the solutions to some of these issues. That's our job. Like that's what we need to do. Like that's what we should be preparing kids to do. You know, these problems are gonna fall to them, and they're not ever gonna go away. So they're gonna change and adapt, and we need to make sure they're ready for that.